Crow Country is a magnificent survival horror throwback that expertly employs the gameplay and vibes of early Resident Evil and Silent Hill titles, with character designs that reference the ersatz 3D anime look of Final Fantasy VII, Legend of Dragoon, and other classic titles from like a one-year window in Japanese game design. It's a magnificent experience that you should go and play immediately. That said, if you've already played it and are a little confused by exactly what happened, come on back and I'll walk you through the story in the clearest and most understandable order of all. Chronological order. This isn't going to be a game recap where I walk you through the events as Mara Forrest experiences them. This is a story explainer where I'll be laying out everything that happened in order so you can understand the context for everyone's actions. Obviously, this is going to be extremely spoiler intensive, so please consider yourself warned, because the game involves time travel. Picking a starting point can be a little tricky, but the game only features characters from the 1990 section of the timeline, so we'll start where their story does, with a trip that Edward Crow takes with his father in 1953. While we don't know much about Crow's early life, it's fair to say that his family was pretty wealthy. This room is a tribute to their success in the railroad industry, and we have obvious proof of the extent of their wealth based on the fact that just days after finding the first strange moving tendrils in the ground, the father is able to easily purchase hundreds of acres of land, basically the whole area where Crow Country now sits, as well as a huge swath of land around it. There's a bit of confusion about the naming of the land here. When he bought it, the area was called Condor Country, Georgia. But after purchasing it, he renamed it after himself, Crow Country. Now, that should probably be Crow County rather than country, but that's not super important. Why was he in such a hurry to buy the land? Because the tendrils that he and his son discovered, while seemingly made out of copper, were actually just copper coating around a core of solid, completely pure gold. Clearly they weren't a natural phenomenon, but searching for an explanation of where they came from would have risked powerful interests finding out about the gold, and possibly seizing their fortune. So the father and son kept quiet about the origin of their windfall and harvested the gold a little at a time, gradually increasing their family's already impressive amount of wealth. Edward's father then began making plans to build something huge so that they could have lots of machinery out in the country without drawing too much attention to it. Cutting off a few pounds of gold here and there was one thing. He wanted to expand it on an industrial scale. Fatefully, the business they decided on was an amusement park. Over the next 20 years, the father built up the park and harvested sections of the roots a bit at a time. Meanwhile, Edward went to school, got a degree in biochemistry at Emory University in Atlanta, married, and had a daughter, Natalie, who was born in 1963. Her age is one of the confusing things about the game. We're told it's 27 during the main action quite clearly, but locked in the trunk of Edward's car is a set of shoes that he seemingly purchased as a gift for her on her 17th birthday. Is this a typo, or have they been there for nearly a decade? Also, when the park was shut down in 1988, his planned birthday gifts for her at age 25 were park merchandise from the gift shop. But that's not really relevant to the timeline, so let's get back to it. When his father died, Edward took over the family business and began a plan of fully industrializing the root harvesting operation. They had, at this point, taken so many pieces off the root that they had to start digging deep to continue harvesting gold. This led to the construction of an entire subsection below the park, a hollowed-out cavern that they suspended a catwalk over, installing machines that allowed them to pull the roots up, sever pieces of them, and move the gold out. It would then be separated from the copper and stored for later use. While the park had a large number of regular employees, only a select few knew about the roots and the gold harvesting operation. There was Pike, the director of park operations and construction, who provided cover for the mining, Tolman, who was in charge of the machinery to perform the actual extractions, and Marvin, who Edward employed for the most complicated job of all, laundering the gold. Edward had realized there was no way to sell huge amounts of gold without drawing questions about where it came from. Gold is a relatively controlled commodity, after all. So working together with Marvin, Edward hatched a plan. Find and purchase a played-out gold mine, then pretend to find new veins of gold inside, which you can pretend to mine, and then sell the gold. It was an ambitious plan, but logistically difficult. The only empty mine they could find to purchase was in Brazil, which meant shipping all the gold they wanted to sell thousands of miles. In addition to this, Marvin had to hire dozens of workers to pretend to operate a mine, lest he run into the exact same problem of just where the gold was coming from. For the most part, buyers were happy to just purchase the gold and look the other way. But if anyone were to look closely into the operation, their habit of shaving the gold into tiny pieces and crushing it into stones wouldn't hold up to a lot of scrutiny. Tragedy struck during this period as Edward's wife Autumn died, leaving him with nothing in his life but the secret gold mining operation. According to his later statements, he never really cared about the money. They had more than enough, more than they could ever spend. He just kept doing it to maintain a connection to his late father and, even more pointedly, because once the machine of generating capital gets rolling, it's incredibly hard to stop it. Unfortunately, this caused him to grow distant from his daughter, critically damaging their relationship. In a fun aside, he names the 7 routes after the days of the week and attaches title cards drawn from the famous poem about the character of children born on a given day. In case you weren't aware, this poem, and specifically the line, "Wednesday's child is full of woe," is what the character Wednesday Addams is named after. The only line plaque without a nameplate from the poem is Sunday, which Edward preserves because it was the first route he found. He even goes so far as to build a shrine memorializing the camping trip on which he and his father found the routes, since that's the pivot around which the rest of his life has turned. In the late 80s, things started to take a dramatic turn. In 1987, 2 major events transpired. The first is that a reporter discovered the connection between Edward Crowe and the Brazilian gold mine. And the second is that all of their digging finally exposed where the roots originated. A pool of mysterious liquid deep within the earth. Unable to contain his curiosity, Edward began performing experiments on the pool. We hear of one example in which he dipped a key into it, and when he pulled it back out, the key was elongated and warped, having been deformed in some way by the contents of the pool. It's at this point that everything goes real bad. Edward had secured access to the pool and set up a lab to study it. Despite it being completely locked down, on March 21st, 1988, Edward is shocked to discover that someone is standing next to the pool on one of the cameras. He and Tolman go to see the man and discover that there's something hideously wrong with him. He makes strange sounds. His clothing doesn't seem to fit because his body is all warped. He's barely able to communicate. Over the next few days, they try to find out what this man, who they call the guest, was doing by the pool, and where he came from. But they get nowhere. He won't eat or drink, and Edward refuses to take him to the hospital. Tolman suggests shutting down the harvesting operation until they know what's going on with the guest, but Edward insists on keeping it running. They turn a storage room into a holding cell so that they can interview the guest without constantly having to go down to the lab. It's during one of these conversations that Pike overhears them talking to the guest, and while he doesn't get the gist of the conversation, he knows there's something horribly wrong with the guest. Finally, the guest is able to explain to Edward, and only Edward, exactly what's going on. The pool is a time travel device sent back from the year 2106, and the roots are a key part of the machine. The antenna that pick up and focus the signals being sent through time. The year 2106 is an uninhabitable wasteland, and the guest has been sent back to 1988 in an attempt to keep the future Earth from becoming uninhabitable. Unfortunately, with the machine's antenna being horribly damaged, a full 50% of the total structure had already been dismantled. The pool can't assemble people properly in the past, which explains the awful, shambling state of the guest. Horrified by this newfound knowledge, Edward leaves and tries to figure out what to do. Unfortunately, he leaves the door to the storage room the guest is locked in unattended at the worst possible time. Elaine Marshall, a teenager celebrating her 15th birthday, is visiting the park with her parents. While wandering around, she finds her way down an access hall and enters the storage room, where she finds the guest. He reaches through the bars of the cell, badly scratching her with his gnarled hands. Elaine flees and is rushed to the hospital, claiming she was attacked by a monstrous man. Authorities undoubtedly search the park, but the guest has been disposed of by the time they arrive. Just days after the guest came through the pool, Edward has been forced to shut down the park. It would never reopen, but the harvesting operations continued. On March 27th, 2 more guests emerged from the pool. Tolman and Edward were ready this time, with alarms triggered by new arrivals on the cameras. They'd switched from simple security cameras to recordings, so they now had clear evidence that the guests were climbing out of the pool without having gone in. But what good would evidence do when they had no interest in involving any other parties in the problem? These guests were even more distorted and broken than the first, and completely unable to communicate, so Edward murdered them, believing he was putting them out of their misery. This is where the timeline gets a little confused. Tolman is completely clear in his notes that all of these events occurred around March 1988. But the newspaper covering the incident with the guest makes it clear that Elaine was attacked on July 5th, 1988, during a trip to Crow Country for her 15th birthday. We know the exact date because the file lists her birth date as July 5th, 1973. There's no way to reconcile these dates, suggesting an error by the developers. It's not going to be the last one either. Luckily, they don't have any major effect on the game's narrative. We can just assume that everything actually happened in June and July, rather than March. Tolman's next note has him shutting down the extraction apparatus in the aftermath of the attack on Elaine, and that note is listed as happening in July. Speaking of Elaine, the injury she received included a persistent infection that her doctors were unable to heal, likely because it was from the future and they'd never seen anything like it. Her family asks Edward Crowe to pay for her treatment, but he refuses responsibility and won't agree to contact them. His justification for this? He claims that his motive wasn't cruel or selfish, no. His belief is that if Elaine's parents can afford to treat the infection, they'll consult experts on infections who will identify how unusual it is, causing further investigations into the park, any of which could spread the infection further, which is the last thing he wants. As Elaine's health declines, her family hires Julie Barron, a local attorney, to sue Edward, but he refuses to engage with the proceedings at all, ignoring court orders. Edward instead focuses entirely on trying to find a cure for the infection using his knowledge of biochemistry. He resumes the harvesting operations, cutting more and more of the roots out, hoping that by examining increasingly more damaged and distorted versions of people from the future, he'd be able to understand the infection and cure it. We can see evidence of these attempts in the bottles of medication scattered all over his office. His constant work with the guests winds up with him getting infected as well, so he pulls even further back from people, eventually resorting to contacting his daughter only by telephone. There's a note by Tolman in March of 1989 commenting on the fact that guests are now coming through the pool every day, each one more deformed than the last. Tolman becomes desperate to know where they're coming from, but Edward won't tell him. This note happening in March 1989 is presumably why there's a discrepancy about all of the 1988 notes being set in March, rather than June and July as they probably should have been. As things are falling apart in the park, the mining operation starts to have problems of its own. Someone in the Brazilian government gets tipped off that something suspicious is going on in the gold mine. There's no evidence of who it is that actually did that, but let's face it, it's probably the previous owners, who are understandably curious about how their played-out mine is suddenly hugely productive. In any case, the government organizes an inspection to make sure that the mine isn't just being used as a way to launder illegally sourced gold. Since that's exactly what's happening, Marvin is understandably nervous about the situation. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Crow Country begins to develop a mysterious reputation given how strange the events are around its closure. A local teenager, Arthur Mole, decides to investigate the place and manages to get a photo of one of the guests. But it's not a very good image, and he winds up being ridiculed when he submits it to a magazine. We've got another error here, as the magazine article is dated August 1987, but that was a year before the first guests appeared and the park closed, so it's likely that the date was supposed to be August 1989. After being ridiculed by the paranormal magazine he'd sent the picture to, Arthur resolves to go back to the park and get a better picture of one of the creatures. Down in Brazil, the inspection of the mine goes badly, and the authorities seize all of Marvin's assets until he can explain where the gold is coming from. He decides to return to America and demand money from Edward to make up for his losses. At the same time, Edward puts the finishing touches on his cure for the guest's infection, and is faced with the problem of how he's actually going to get it to Elaine, since by this point he's so ravaged by his own disease that he can't risk leaving the park. You may ask why he doesn't take the cure himself. It's because he's so guilty over the possibility that he's doomed the future that he feels he doesn't deserve to go on living, but he can't die before he makes things right with Elaine. After being unable to contact her father for weeks, Natalie Crowe files a missing persons report, and given how rich her family is, the police actually take it seriously. A Detective Harrison is assigned to the case, and while investigating the disappearance, he goes to visit the Marshall family at the hospital, as their long-standing grudge with Edward Crowe would give them a motive to make him disappear. While Harrison is talking to her parents, the now terminally ill Elaine overhears that he plans to go and investigate Crow Country the next day. She decides that before she succumbs to her illness, she's going to confront Edward Crowe and find out why he refused to pay his debts back when it would have actually helped. She dyes her hair purple and uses makeup in an attempt to look older. Then early in the morning goes to Harrison's house and breaks into his car, stealing his ID and slashing his tires, hoping to get him to cancel his trip to Crow Country, allowing her free run of the place, pretending to be a police officer with a modified version of Harrison's ID under the fake name Mara Forrest. Harrison sees her slashing the tires, but doesn't get a good look at her. The break-in and slash tires don't dissuade Harrison, who takes a bike to the park, arriving much later than Elaine. At the same time, Arthur returns to the park, hoping to get a better picture of one of the guests. He succeeds, but winds up mauled by the guest and infected with the same disease as Elaine. Marvin returns to the park, and is surprised to see the state of it. He had no idea how bad things had gone. It's unclear exactly what happens next, But given the condition of the park and the fact that Marvin was desperate for money, it's likely that he went to see Pike, who was in charge of park operations, and the two men got into a fight that led to Marvin shooting Pike. When Elaine finds the body, she assumes it was a suicide because there's a gun in the room, and his final video message certainly suggests that he could have been ready to kill himself. But it's a little more likely that Marvin is responsible, given that we know he was running around the park with a gun and a desperate need for money. Julie, the lawyer responsible for suing Edward, goes to the park on the same day, planning to serve Edward with papers, officially starting the lawsuit. Finally, Natalie goes to the park to find her father, and winds up getting poisoned by one of the guests. Is this a lot of people coincidentally arriving on the same day? Yeah. But it's a coincidence we can accept for the sake of dramatic escalation. From here, the main events of the game occur. Elaine explores the park, gradually uncovering its mysteries. Marvin tries to cover up the events at the park, hoping to grab some cash and avoid legal responsibility. This leads to him knocking out Julie and locking her in a crate, so that she'll be out of the way until he's gone. Elaine rescues Julie, but she winds up infected anyway when she is grabbed by the monster that lives in the vents. It's not entirely clear why she doesn't recognize Elaine when she sees her. Apparently the makeup and hair dye did a better job than one would expect. Harrison manages to find his way into the heart of the facility, but he's murdered by Marvin to keep the park's secrets from the authorities. Marvin himself dies shortly afterwards, when he's accidentally knocked off the catwalk by Julie and falls dozens of meters to the floor of the cavern below. Elaine finally gets to the secret lab and manages to confront Edward, who explains the story to her and gives her the 5 doses of cure he's managed to produce. It's enough to save everyone but Edward himself, but, of course, he has no interest in living through the day. Instead, he wants to go through the pool so he can see the state of the future for himself. He returns moments later in a horribly deformed state. He tries to describe the future to Elaine, but she's unwilling to hear it. Fulfilling her promise to him, she kills Edward then flees the park, bringing the cure to all of the survivors. Then the credits roll in the game, with the characters left wondering exactly what the future holds for them. It's a pretty fantastic story overall, truly one of the high points of this genre. Let's look at a couple of fun things in the game, specifically all of the great hints that the developers have dropped about what's going on. When the park was closed, they were about to start construction on a 4th area, one themed around the future. So Edward's actions literally canceled the future. There's plenty of clues around Elaine's true identity. The monologue at the start of the game seems like Mara's talking to the player, but once you know the truth, it's quite obviously her talking to herself, reminding herself about the importance of keeping her ruse going. The ID card she has is quite crudely altered. Even with the low-resolution graphics, it's pretty clear that the name Mara Forrest was added with a label maker. When Elaine interacts with the cigarette machine, she says she's not allowed to smoke, which is a little odd for a cop to say. In the gift shop, when Elaine interacts with the personalized nameplates, she goes straight to the EA names, despite supposedly being named Mara. When she arrives at the park and interacts with the admission sign, she talks about how reasonably priced the place has always been, establishing she's been there before, which is reinforced by Edward's statement to her over the phone that she is returning to the park. When Natalie meets Elaine, she immediately thinks that she's too young to be a police investigator. If you look at the trunk of Elaine's car, you can see not only the variety of medication she uses to be able to function, but also a box of purple hair dye that she used to transform her appearance. The biggest clue comes in her conversation with Tolman. The first time you see it, it's just a little weird, but once you know who Mara is, it's completely clear that, unlike almost everyone else, he immediately knows that she's actually Elaine, referencing her dyed hair and the fact that she's returned to the park even though she was injured there. The best clue in the game isn't about Elaine's true identity, though. It's this observation from Tolman's office when she interacts with his radio. She comments that the sound is terrible because the antenna is broken. Right there, it lays out the origin of all of the monsters, even though it's not going to be clear that that's what's meant, for 2 hours. Just fantastic work by the developers. Also, here's the carpeting from The Shining, which all horror games legally must include at some point. And here's the absolute nicest thing the developers did, other than putting in a no combat mode. In Edward's office, there's a puzzle to unlock the central elevator. To solve it, you need to look over the various monster files and figure out the numbers associated with each of them. Or, for the last digit, the number that isn't associated with any of them. But if you can't figure it out or simply don't want to work on it, the code is written here, on the wall of Edward's inner sanctum. Come on, that's just great. Also, it suddenly occurs to me that I never explained exactly what happened to the world that made it uninhabitable, like what the game's message is. The game doesn't tell you outright, of course, but as with all of the other clues, they made sure to make it absolutely clear if you're paying attention. Now, it's important to remember that the guests aren't trying to hurt anyone, they're just desperate to get their message across. That's why they scroll 2106, the year they're from, on all of the walls in blood. So when trying to get the message of what happened to the world across, what can they possibly do if they can barely think or write coherently? Check out the haunted house when Elaine first arrives at it. Now here's what it looks like towards the end of the game. What's changed? I'll let the game answer that for me. The world is on fire. That's right, this is a game about global warming. So that's Crow Country. Hopefully this cleared up any confusion you may have had about the story. If there's anything I missed, for example, if you know what's going on with the weirdo in the vents, or what this code for the dice floor means, please let me know down in the comments. For now though, I've been the Hidden Object Guru. Thanks for watching. If you had a good time and you'd like to see more, be sure to like and subscribe. Questions and help go in the comments section below the video. You can play my horror game, Clown in the Woods, over on itch.io for free, unless you're using Opera. Apparently it doesn't work on Opera. Oh well. I will see you back here for more horror videos, but until then I'll say that's right. Au revoir.